All right, we're looking at another game from round one from the Gibraltar Chess Festival, which started today. This game is between Women's GM Papp, that's Papp, versus the legendary Grandmaster with the black pieces and uh, everyone's favorite, one of my favorite Grandmasters, Vassily Ivanchuk. And we're going to start this game from move 42. The reason why is because I'm more interested to show you the ending. And what you're about to see here is what is called a swindle. Um, well, you know what? Yeah, it is sort of a swindle because this position is pretty much drawn, but Ivanchuk is going to show his class. Ivanchuk's rating is about 2750, give or take a few points right now, and women's GM Pap is rated about 2352, and she plays a commendable game here to get to this point where the position is pretty much equal. Again, Pap has the white pieces, Ivanchuk the black pieces. So let's point out some features of this bishop ending. As we can see, sorry about that. Let me just go back here and get back to where I was. Okay, this is where I want to start. Okay, so it's Ivanchuk the move, and here's some features that I want to point out with this position. First of all, we have two bishops the same color, right? So the opposite bishop thing is out the window. So we don't have to worry about that, right? The bishops are the same color. Now, if you notice, if you look at Ivanchuk's pawns, right, he has one pawn on a5, that's on the dark square, and also on f6, that's on the dark square. He has to be very cognizant of that since they can be attacked by GM Pap's bishop. And if you look at the white pawns, all of them are on white squares except this one that's on d4. And GM Pap has to be very aware of that because that is the only pawn that Ivanchuk's bishop is able to capture. With that, we can think about some strategy here. Of course, Ivanchuk with the black pieces wants to liquidate these the dark, his weaknesses. He wants to get rid of the pawns that's on the dark squares, right? And liquidate his weaknesses in general while leaving white with her weaknesses. White would love to get rid of this pawn in d4 and trade it off, but of course Ivanchuk is not going to allow that to happen. Ivanchuk in a million years is not going to play c5 and allow that to happen. So this pawn or bishop is pretty much relegated to defending this pawn. Whereas, and that's the power of blockade for you. Whereas Ivanchuk's weaknesses can be mitigated. For instance, he can move to f5, right? This isolated pawn here can be traded off, right? So Ivanchuk's position is a bit more flexible than black's. A bit more flexible than white's. However, is that enough to win? No, this position, um, white should still be able to hold this position. Let's see what happens now with those thoughts in mind. Okay, so Pat played f4 here in this position. Ivanchuk plays a5. Bishop g3. So we see some waiting maneuvers and perhaps trying to provoke more pawns on the black squares. For instance, move like this, for example, and some amateur might play a move like g5 to drive away the bishop. But this is really a weakening move because it places more pawns on the dark squares. Ivanchuk plays bishop b7. Excuse me, king b7. I've been looking at a lot of chess today. And there it is, bishop h4, attacking this pawn. Again, a lot of beginning players would make a move like that because it attacks the bishop, right? Figure I'm going to make an attacking move. However, it's really a weakening move because after the bishop moves, there's another pawn that black has to keep his eye on now, because two pawns are on the dark squares, and eventually this bishop may make its way round to d8 with attacks on these pawns. So you don't want to create more weaknesses. You want to diminish them. So here's an instructive moment for you all. See, Ivanchuk plays f5, even though that might allow white to split its pawn structure by, for instance, playing a move like this. It's better to have this than where these pawns cannot be attacked, right? These pawns cannot be attacked by this bishop. Only the king can attack them. It's better to have that than have the weakness, than have the permanent weakness of having two pawns on the dark squares like that with the opponent's dark square bishop floating around. So f5 is played, bishop g5, the king moves into b6, bishop h6, king b5, and we see Ivanchuk infiltrating on the queen side. Notice he couldn't get in really on the center, so he infiltrates on the queen side. So he's putting a lot of psychological pressure on white, because white is stuck defending this pawn, either with the king or the bishop. And what black is going to do right now is liquidate this other pawn that's on the dark square, right? So h4 is played. There's a4. You see, that's what I was talking about earlier, how black is easily able to get rid of his weaknesses. So he takes, g takes h5, g takes h5. Now, remember this maneuver on white. Just trip along with me to the king side and look at this h pawn, because it seems insignificant that white tried to advance this pawn. In actuality, there's no reason to move this pawn, because all it does is make the pawns harder to defend, right, by advancing this pawn up here. See, with the king way over here, advancing this pawn up here makes it very difficult for the king to defend. Meanwhile, if the pawn stays where it is, then if some pawns get traded off or what have you, say, let's just make let's just go back for a second. Let's say Ivanchuk wind up playing something like this. See, it's easy to defend this because the king can, just scoot right over. It's easy to keep an eye on that. Now, of course, he has to worry about this, things like that later on, these past pawn creation, but that's not the point. It's just to show that he can keep an eye on it. And then if he does choose to advance, he has his own pass pawn that he could possibly create. Or she, rather, sorry. So king b5, Papp decides to advance the h pawn, but with no real prospects of queening. Right? h5. So you may ask, well, what is the pawn doing there? So now this pawn is on h5. Now, the good side is that it's on a light square, so it can't be attacked by anything but a king. Nevertheless, though, it is far away. So, bishop returns to e7, bishop f4, and we see bishop f6 now putting pressure on this pawn. Again, how to defend. Papp played bishop d6. Now, if bishop e5, it's not good for Ivanchuk to take here. bishop e7 would be better. That's why I was saying there's plenty of chances for white to hold comfortably here. Bishop d6, and Ivanchuk liquidates his pawn. A takes b3. So now when we look at the pawns, we see the progress of the 2700 plus grandmaster. He's gotten rid of his weaknesses, but white is still left with her weakness on d4. But still, it's not enough to win. So more maneuvering. King b6, king d3, bishop to g5, king c3, shuffling around. And can you see the plan right now for that Ivanchuk is pursuing? He puts his bishop here on this diagonal. This is how far this guy is thinking ahead. Right? He's not just making meaningless moves. I have the feeling that GM Pat, some of her moves are just kind of shuffling around, just marking time. But I feel like Ivanchuk has a plan the whole time. So we can see right here, this bishop is on this diagonal right here. So guarding it basically. Along with this pawn here, it's very hard for this king to get over to the king side. I mean, for the white king to get to the king side, I mean, it would have to take a long route, excuse me, and then it's cut off again here and here. Let's get rid of the less important graphics. Right, so this bishop is very powerful. So this king cannot defend this pawn. And it being on a light square, the bishop cannot defend it either. And now I want you to think about what I said earlier when this pawn was advanced. So now look where Ivanchuk has a bishop. Okay. And then what's great about where this piece is, not only is it hindering white from getting over to the defense of this pawn, but also at a moment's notice, if the king wanders away from the defense here, this bishop can come in harass and force the bishop to defend here. So there it is, bishop e5, and I think she sees what's going on now, so she decides to put the bishop on defensive duty so that she can run over with the king. Bishop e7. And again, notice the squares being cut off. So this king can't even come up here or anything. And if it did, then there's the pawn right there. So a lot of shielding and blockading going on. So the king goes to d3. And we see Ivanchuk is coming after this pawn. And so Papp is attacking this pawn right here, right? And hopefully keeping black's king tied down. But really has no adequate way of defending the h5 pawn. But however, how is Ivanchuk going to leave the defense of this pawn to get this pawn? So bishop c7 was played. And now white has to beware of undermining tactics against this pawn on d4. Right now the king is there, so it's not that big of a deal, but it's just something that has to be kept in mind. For instance, if the king was to be on e3, then c5 would be possible. So bishop c7, bishop h4, bishop b8. And I like the idea Ivanchuk comes up with. And again, this is what I was saying. See how the king wandered away, and now d4 is unprotected. So bishop a7. King goes to f6. And you see the steady, gradual improvement. Bishop b6. Of course, Papp wants to use her bishop in defense also to be able to check the king. So now Ivanchuk goes to e1. With this is an idea. Bishop d8. Ivanchuk has to go back. And now she gets all the way over to defend the king. Excuse me, to defend the pawn at h5. So she's feeling good and happy. And bishop d2 spoils the party, because that move is actually an outright blunder. And that's what we call a swindle. Is when your opponent, you have a pretty much equal position, and there's no way you should lose. Or sometimes you're winning, and then your opponent kind of rocks you to sleep, and you do a blunder and basically give away either your whole advantage, or if the position was equal, you go into some type of losing. You fall into like an elementary trap that if you were just focused and fresh, you would have never fell into that trap. Or sometimes it happens in time trouble. So here, white just basically has to play just king e3, and everything is all good. But instead, she decided to play the natural looking move, assisting this pawn, right? Keeping the king out, keeping the enemy king out of f6, and then the bishop can go and do something else. However, after bishop d2, now the king is driven away. Now the king is no longer attacking this pawn on f7, f5, and now the king on e6 is free to continue to harass now. Right? So now here's the problem. Now the only one that can protect that pawn on d4 is the bishop. Once the bishop goes away, the king can cross the Rubicon right here of the f file. So let's look. Check. Right? That's Ivanchuk just driving it in. You see? Just driving it in. He's like, that hurt, don't it? He knows. He sees everything. Believe it. He sees it already. He's just do that extra checking. Maybe he's double checking his variations, or low on time or something. But he sees it. So there it is. There's an attack on the pawn. Forces the bishop away from this diagonal. King d7. Right? Now it's just going to attack the bishop. King drops back to g3. Bishop a7. Let's go back a bit. Now here, instead of king d7, king f6 is possible. Bishop d8, and then king g7. That's forced. Bishop b6, and then h6. This is the correct sequence. Then perhaps bishop c7, bishop g5, driving the king away, king g3, and then you kidnap the pawn. Okay. Now I don't know if Ivanchuk missed it, or he looked at it and evaluated it. But he goes off on this tangent idea of going back to c8. And then it seems like he gets the idea and he comes back. And again, perhaps he was marking some time, trying to gain some moves here. And you see him, now he's on f6, and he does it. So You would have to get inside his mind to see why he went all the way back to c8 with the king. He could have been trying to mark time. He might have not seen the variation first, but then he was like, "Oh, wait a minute, this, you know." So, and you get an analogous situation to what I just showed you. King on h6, bishop f6, and then he just checks. There's the pawn. So now, something else that white has to deal with, and that proves to be too much, because now you have this weakness, and you have to try to stop this extra pawn on the h file. So step one, the bishop is tied up. Okay, driving the king further back. So now Ivanchuk has room to operate. Piling up. Now we're attacking another weakness. And they call this in chess sometimes the rule of two weaknesses. Sometimes one weakness in a position is not enough to win, so you strive to create another one. So here you have the f3 pawn, and you have the d4 pawn, both weak. So while the king and bishop are tied up in the defense of these, who's going to stop this guy from running down the board? And of course, once the king is distracted, or bishop, or what rather, distracted trying to stop the h pawn, then the d pawn or the f pawn will fall. So we can safely say that white is lost in this position. King f1, bishop h4, is continuing to improve the position. And this is all setting up, putting the king in the right place in these crucial squares here. This is all setting up for the advance of this h pawn. Bishop e5, and there it is, h5, offering the trade of bishops, of course. And of course, Ivanchuk is not thinking about playing that move, but he's just moving the bishop out of the way to clear the marching path for this h pawn. And now Papp is put in a situation where she would have to sacrifice the bishop. Ivanchuk throws the check in first, and Papp resigned. So that was an interesting endgame played by both players, and Papp being only 23-52, playing somebody legendary as Ivanchuk, all the way down to the ending like this, and basically having the draw in hand, but just making the critical mistake. She could definitely be proud of herself. There were two things here. One was a minor mistake, and one was major. And the minor mistake I felt was just putting yourself in that position by advancing this pawn earlier. There was no real prospects of it queening or anything, so therefore you should keep it close to you for defensive purposes. So that was one mistake, is the advance of this pawn, because she put it in a place where only really black could get it. Okay, she already had this one weakness, but she was able to maintain with that and then created another one. And then, of course, moving forward, the other mistake was playing her king and to try to get closer to the pawn, when she should have probably just played king e3 instead. And this was the move right here. That was the major error. So instead of allowing this bishop to come behind her like that, it's king e3, and we're still battling on in the position. But instead, return to the main line. Instead, this move, king g5, which probably was the decisive error because it cost Papp to lose his pawn. And there's no good way to keep it. And then, of course, Ivanchuk went on a journey with the king this way, but then found out that he has to go this way, and he figured that out. And you can see that it made me laugh just looking at it. Um, but he played a good ending here, and again he just finally gets that pawn that shouldn't have been there in the first place. Then he plays a nice quality ending here. So that will be it for this video. And as usual, as I always say, please like and subscribe. I hope you're learning a great deal about chess from this channel. And I'll see you guys on the next video.